The sharp crack of Richard's hand against my cheek echoed through the marble halls of the Metropolitan Museum like a gunshot. 300 of New York's elite froze mid-conversation, their champagne glasses suspended in air, their perfectly practiced smiles cracking like fine porcelain. I touched my burning cheek, feeling the sting radiate through my face as the orchestra's waltz died into silence. The sound of my champagne flute shattering against the floor seemed to last forever, each crystal shard catching the chandelier light as it scattered across the marble. "You embarrassed me in front of everyone," Richard hissed through clenched teeth, his sharp New York accent cutting through the stunned silence. His steel gray eyes held that familiar coldness that had become my daily companion over the past 20 years of marriage. From across the ballroom, I heard a voice I hadn't heard in decades, warm and familiar despite the years between us. "Ladies and gentlemen, please continue enjoying the evening. James Carter, my billionaire ex-boyfriend, the man whose charity gala we were attending, the man whose very presence had triggered my millionaire ex-husband's violent outburst. I should have seen this coming. 6 months earlier, I never imagined that discovering I was pregnant at 42 would be the first domino in a chain reaction that would destroy my perfectly constructed life and reveal the narcissistic abuse I'd endured for 2 decades. The murmur of shocked guests filled the air as society matrons whispered behind their jeweled hands. Heels clicked on marble as people either moved closer to witness the drama or backed away in embarrassment. I stood there, one hand on my still flat stomach protecting the 12-week-old life growing inside me, the other still pressed to my throbbing cheek. "Sarah." James's voice was closer now, that thoughtful Midwestern tone that used to make me feel safe when we were young and foolish and believed love could conquer anything. "Are you all right?" Richard straightened his $5,000 tuxedo and smiled that practiced politician's smile he'd perfected during his rise from middle-class insurance salesman to millionaire real estate mogul. "Just a misunderstanding between husband and wife. Nothing to concern yourself with." "Carter?" But I saw the way James's jaw tightened, the way his hands clenched at his sides. At 45, he'd grown into the confident, successful man I'd always known he could become. The awkward college boy I'd loved and left was now a billionaire philanthropist whose business empire spanned 3 continents. "There's no misunderstanding when a man strikes a pregnant woman in public," James said quietly, but his voice carried across the ballroom. Several other men stepped forward, their faces grim with disapproval. My heart hammered against my ribs. How did he know I was pregnant? Had it been that obvious during our brief conversation earlier, when Richard had dragged me away before I could do more than stammer a hello to the man who'd once promised to love me forever? "This is a private matter," Richard snapped, his voice rising. The businessman's composure he prided himself on was cracking like ice in spring. "Sarah is my wife. She's carrying my child. And that gives you the right to hit her." The question came from Margaret Carter, James's 70-year-old mother, her refined Boston accent cutting through the tension like a blade. She moved through the crowd with the authority of old money and older wisdom, her silver hair gleaming under the chandeliers. The room held its breath. In our social circle, when Margaret Carter spoke, people listened. Her late husband had been a senator. Her family's name graced hospital wings and university buildings. Her disapproval could end careers and close doors that would never open again. "Mrs. Carter, I think there's been a misunderstanding," Richard began, his voice switching to the smooth charm he used when negotiating million-dollar deals. "The only misunderstanding here is a grown man thinking he can strike a woman and call it a private matter." Margaret's voice was steel-wrapped in silk. "Security, please escort Mr. Mitchell from the premises." I watched in stunned silence as 2 men in black suits appeared at Richard's elbows. He looked around the ballroom, perhaps expecting support from the other wealthy men who understood that wives were investments to be managed, not partners to be respected. Instead, he found faces turned away, conversations resuming as if he'd already ceased to exist. "Sarah." His voice was different now, smaller somehow. "Sarah, we need to talk about this at home." The word home sent ice through my veins. Home was where Richard's anger could expand without witnesses. Home was where my pregnant body would be even more vulnerable. Home was where the financial control he exercised so carefully could tighten like a noose. "No," I said quietly, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. I don't think we do. For 20 years, I'd been the perfect wife. I'd hosted his business dinners, smiled at his crude jokes, pretended not to notice when his flirtations with other women crossed lines. I'd given up my teaching career, my friends, my dreams, all to support his ambitions. I'd made myself smaller and smaller until I almost disappeared entirely. But standing there in that ballroom, surrounded by the debris of my shattered illusions, I felt something awakening that I thought had died long ago. My voice, my strength, my worth. Don't make this worse than it already is, Richard warned. But there was desperation beneath the threat now. James stepped closer, close enough that I could smell his cologne, the same woodsy scent he'd worn in college. Sarah doesn't have to go anywhere she doesn't want to go. The crowd watched our triangle of tension like spectators at a tennis match. Some held phones, no doubt already posting to social media about the scandal unfolding at the city's most exclusive charity event. By morning, everyone would know that Richard Mitchell, millionaire real estate developer, had publicly struck his pregnant wife at the Metropolitan Museum Gala. "You have no idea what you're interfering with," Richard snarled at James, his mask finally slipping completely. "She's nothing. She was nothing when you knew her, and she's nothing now. The only thing that ever mattered about her was what I could make her into." The words hit harder than his hand had. 20 years of subtle put-downs and casual cruelties crystallized into that single, devastating assessment. I was nothing. I had always been nothing. I would always be nothing, except that wasn't true. "You're wrong," I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. "I was never nothing. I just forgot who I was for a while." The security guards were already guiding Richard toward the exit, but he twisted back to look at me one last time. "You'll regret this, Sarah. You'll come crawling back when you realize what you've thrown away." "The only thing I'm throwing away is 20 years of pretending to be someone I'm not," I replied. And then he was gone, swallowed by the marble corridors of the museum, leaving me standing in the wreckage of my old life with 300 witnesses and the man I'd never stopped loving. 6 months earlier, life felt perfect in the way that only an illusion can feel perfect. I woke each morning in our 12,000 square foot Connecticut mansion to the sound of birds chirping in the perfectly manicured gardens and the distant hum of Richard's coffee maker brewing his daily dark roast. The morning I discovered I was pregnant, everything seemed possible. I sat on the cold marble of our master bathroom floor, watching the pink line appear on the pregnancy test like a miracle I'd given up hoping for. At 42, after years of failed attempts and Richard's growing indifference to the idea of children, I'd assumed that particular door had closed forever. But here it was, a second pink line, a new beginning, a tiny heartbeat that would change everything. The timer on my phone beeped, confirming what I already knew. 3 minutes. 3 minutes to discover that my life was about to transform in ways I couldn't begin to imagine. I stumbled to my feet, legs shaky with excitement and terror. Through the bathroom window, I could see Richard on the terrace, reading his morning papers while checking his phone. The picture of success in his silk pajamas and Italian leather slippers. My millionaire husband, who'd built his empire from nothing but ambition and ruthless determination. How would he react? We'd talked about children early in our marriage, but those conversations had faded as his business grew, and my dreams of motherhood seemed increasingly unlikely. Would he be thrilled? Worried, angry about the timing? I wrapped my silk robe more tightly around myself and padded downstairs to the kitchen, my bare feet silent on the Italian marble floors. Everything in our house was marble or crystal or imported from somewhere expensive. Richard said it reflected our status, our success. I sometimes felt like I was living in a museum where I was both the curator and the most fragile exhibit. "Richard," I called softly as I stepped onto the terrace. "Can we talk?" He looked up from his Wall Street Journal, his steel gray eyes assessing me with the same calculating expression he used when evaluating potential real estate investments. "What is it? I have the Morrison meeting at 9. "I have some news." I sat down across from him at our glass patio table, my hands trembling slightly as I reached for my morning tea. "Good news, I think. Did the contractor finally finish the pool house?" He turned back to his paper, already losing interest. "No, Richard, it's not about the house." I took a deep breath, tasting the spring air and the possibility of joy. "I'm pregnant. The newspaper crinkled as his hands tightened on it. For a moment, he didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even breathe. Then he slowly lowered the paper and looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. Pregnant, he repeated, his voice flat. Yes, I took 3 tests. I'm about 6 weeks along. The words tumbled out of me in a rush of nervous excitement. I know we didn't plan this, but Richard, we're going to have a baby. After all these years, we're finally going to be parents. He set down his newspaper and leaned back in his chair, studying me like I was a problem that needed solving. How did this happen? The question stung more than it should have. Well, you know, when a man and woman love each other very much. Don't be cute, Sarah. We've been careful. You've been on birth control for years. Birth control isn't 100% effective. You know that. I reached across the table to touch his hand, but he pulled away. Richard, this is a blessing. We've wanted this for so long. Have we? His voice was cold now, businesslike. Or is that just something you've wanted? The words hit me like a slap. I sat back in my chair, suddenly aware of how alone I felt, even sitting 3 feet away from my husband. I mean, we talked about children. You said you wanted a family. That was 20 years ago. Sarah, before I built the business, before we had responsibilities. He picked up his coffee cup, his movements precise and controlled. A baby changes everything. The timing is all wrong. When would be the right time? I asked, though I was beginning to understand that for Richard, there would never be a right time for anything that didn't serve his ambitions. He was quiet for a long moment, and I found myself holding my breath, hoping for some sign of the joy I'd expected, the celebration I'd imagined. Instead, he sighed deeply and reached for his phone. I need to make some call, he said, standing up from the table. We'll talk about this later. Richard, wait. I stood too, my silk robe billowing around me in the morning breeze. This is our child, our baby. Doesn't that mean anything to you? He paused at the French doors leading back into the house. Of course it does, but we need to be practical about this. We need to think about what this means for our lives, our lifestyle, our plans. And then he was gone, leaving me alone on the terrace with my cold tea and my crushing disappointment. I sank back into my chair and pressed my hands to my still flat stomach, where a tiny life was growing despite its father's lukewarm reception. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to Linda's number. Linda Hayes had been my best friend since college, one of the few relationships Richard hadn't managed to slowly poison with his disapproval. She lived in California now, working as a marriage counselor, and her voice was always exactly what I needed to hear. Honey, what's wrong? She answered on the second ring, somehow sensing my mood across 3,000 miles. Linda, I'm pregnant. The words came out in a whisper, as if saying them too loudly might make them less real. Oh my God, Sarah, that's wonderful. How far along are you? How are you feeling? What did Richard say? I laughed, but it came out more like a sob. He said the timing is all wrong. The timing is all wrong. Linda's voice rose with indignation. Honey, you're 42 years old. You've been trying to get pregnant for 20 years. When exactly would the timing be right? I don't know. Maybe never. I wiped away tears I hadn't realized were falling. Maybe he never really wanted children. Maybe he just said he did because he thought that's what I wanted to hear. Sarah, listen to me. This baby is a gift. Whether Richard can see that or not doesn't change the fact that you're going to be a mother. You've dreamed about this for years. I know, I just thought, I hoped he'd be happy. Give him time. Men process these things differently. Maybe once it sinks in, he'll come around. But even as Linda said the words, I could hear the doubt in her voice. She'd been counseling couples for 15 years. She'd seen enough marriages to know the difference between initial shock and fundamental rejection. Linda, can I ask you something? Of course, honey. Do you think I'm making a mistake having this baby at my age, with Richard so opposed to it? Linda was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was gentle but firm. Sarah, the only mistake would be letting someone else's fears steal your joy. This is your child, your body, your choice. Don't let anyone make you feel like you need permission to be happy about becoming a mother. After we hung up, I sat alone on the terrace for another hour, watching the gardeners tend to Richard's perfect roses and thinking about choices. About the choices I'd made 20 years ago that led me to this moment. About the choice I'd made in college to leave James Carter and marry Richard instead. About all the small choices since then that had gradually eroded my sense of self until I wasn't sure who I was anymore, beyond being Richard's wife. But now I was going to be someone's mother. That was an identity no one could take away from me, no matter how much they might try. That evening, Richard came home with flowers and champagne, his mood completely transformed. He swept me into his arms and spun me around the kitchen, laughing and apologizing for his earlier reaction. "I was just shocked," he said, kissing my forehead. "But you're right. This is wonderful news. We're going to have a baby." He'd already made plans. He told me over dinner. We'd convert the guest wing into a nursery suite. We'd hire the best nanny money could buy. We'd make sure our child had every advantage, every opportunity. "I was thinking we could spend $50,000 on the nursery," he said, cutting into his perfectly prepared steak. "Really do it right. Designer everything. The best of the best." I smiled and nodded, but something felt wrong about his sudden enthusiasm. It was too calculated, too controlled, like he'd spent the day figuring out how to turn an unexpected pregnancy into another business opportunity, another way to display his wealth and success. But I pushed those doubts away. This was what I'd wanted, wasn't it? For him to be excited about our baby, for us to plan and dream together about our future as parents. I didn't know then that Richard's excitement had nothing to do with becoming a father and everything to do with maintaining control. I didn't understand that his vision of our perfect family was just another carefully constructed image designed to serve his ego and his ambitions. I had no idea that in 6 months, I'd be standing in the Metropolitan Museum with my cheek burning from his hand, finally understanding that the only mistake I'd made was believing that love could change someone who had never truly loved anyone but himself. "Tell me about the dreams, Sarah." Dr. Emily Stone sat across from me in her warmly lit office, her kind eyes focused entirely on my face as I struggled to find words for the nightmares that had been haunting me for weeks. The clock on her wall ticked softly, marking the minutes of another therapy session I was hiding from Richard. "They're always the same," I said, my hands resting protectively over my growing belly. At 16 weeks pregnant, I was finally showing, though I'd gotten expert at hiding it with flowing tops and strategic scarves. "I'm running through empty hallways, trying to find something I've lost, but I can never remember what I'm looking for." "And how do you feel in these dreams?" "Terrified. Like if I don't find whatever it is, something terrible will happen." I shifted in the leather chair, trying to get comfortable. "Dr. Stone, is it normal to feel this anxious during pregnancy? Richard keeps telling me I'm being hormonal, but this feels like more than that." Dr. Stone leaned forward slightly, her silver hair catching the afternoon light filtering through her office windows. "Sarah, you've been seeing me for 2 months now. In that time, you've mentioned that your husband monitors your spending, controls your social interactions, and becomes angry when you make decisions without consulting him first. That's not hormonal anxiety. That's your mind recognizing patterns of narcissistic abuse." The word abuse always made me flinch. Abuse was what happened to other women, weaker women, women who didn't have beautiful homes and successful husbands and everything money could buy. Richard had never hit me before the gala. He just managed me, guided me, helped me make better choices. "He's not abusive," I said automatically. "He's just particular about things. He's built something amazing from nothing, and he wants to protect it. Tell me about college, Sarah. Tell me about James." My breath caught in my throat. I'd mentioned James only once, weeks ago, when Dr. Stone asked if I'd ever been in love before Richard. The question had caught me off guard, and before I could stop myself, I'd said yes. "That was a long time ago." "But you loved him." "I was young. It was different then." I looked out the window at the busy Manhattan street below, where people hurried past with purpose and destination. Love seemed simpler when I was 22. What made it simpler? I closed my eyes and let myself remember. James saw me, not who he wanted me to be, not who he thought I should become, just me. He'd listen when I talked about wanting to teach high school English, and he'd get excited about my ideas. He made me feel like my thoughts mattered. And Richard? The question hung in the air like smoke. I opened my eyes and looked at Dr. Stone, this woman who'd become my lifeline in ways I was only beginning to understand. Richard makes me feel safe, I said finally. Or he used to. Financially safe. Yes, and socially safe. Richard knows how the world works. He knows how to succeed, how to get things done. When I met him, I was this naive girl from Ohio who didn't understand anything about money or status or power. He taught me. What did he teach you? The memories came flooding back then. 20 years of careful instruction on how to be the right kind of wife for the right kind of man, how to dress for business dinners, how to make conversation with important people, how to smile and nod when the men talk business and the women discuss charity work. He taught me how to be someone worthy of his success, I said quietly. And who were you before he taught you that? I was quiet for a long moment, thinking about the girl I'd been in college. Sarah Wilson, English major, student teacher, volunteer reading tutor at the local elementary school. The girl who wore jeans and oversized sweaters and spent hours in coffee shops talking about books and dreams and possibilities. The girl who loved James Carter with the fierce, uncomplicated passion of youth. I was nobody special, I said. Says who? The question hit me like a physical blow. Says who, says Richard, whispered a voice in my head. Richard, who'd spent 20 years subtly and systematically convincing me that I was lucky to have him, that without his guidance and support, I'd be nothing. Sarah, can you tell me about the day you chose Richard over James? I hadn't told her about that choice, but somehow she understood that there had been one. That's what good therapists do, I supposed. They see the choices that shape us, even when we try to hide them. It was graduation weekend, I began, my voice barely above a whisper. James had been accepted to graduate school at Stanford. He wanted me to come with him. He said we could get married, start a life together in California. And Richard had just graduated from business school. He had a job offer in New York, working for a real estate development company. He was older, more sophisticated. He seemed to have everything figured out. I laughed bitterly. James was talking about dreams and possibilities. Richard was talking about security and practical plans. What did James say when you told him you were choosing Richard? The memory hit me like a physical pain, sharp and unexpected after all these years. James standing in the parking lot behind my dorm, his face pale in the streetlight, his hands shaking as I handed him back the simple silver ring he'd given me for Christmas. He said he understood. He said he wanted me to be happy, and if Richard could give me things he couldn't, then I should go. I wiped away tears I didn't remember starting to cry. But his eyes, God, his eyes looked so hurt, like I'd broken something in him that couldn't be fixed. Do you think you made the right choice? It was the question I'd been running from for 20 years. The question that haunted my dreams and followed me through my perfectly appointed days in my perfectly appointed life. I thought I did. Richard offered stability, success, a clear path forward. James was brilliant and kind and funny, but his family's money intimidated me. I was this middle-class girl from Ohio, and the Carters were old Boston money. I convinced myself I didn't belong in that world. And now I wonder if I was just afraid. Afraid that James would eventually realize I wasn't good enough for him. Afraid that his family would never accept me. Afraid that love wouldn't be enough when reality set in. I pressed my hands to my belly, feeling the baby kick as if responding to my emotional turmoil. Richard felt safer because he needed me to be something I wasn't. James felt dangerous because he loved me exactly as I was. Dr. Stone nodded slowly, her expression compassionate but not pitying. Sarah, I want to ask you something, and I want you to really think about your answer. If you could see that 22-year-old girl today, what would you tell her? I closed my eyes and imagined her, young Sarah, standing at the crossroads of her life, holding two futures in her hands like fragile birds, one safe and certain and ultimately empty, one uncertain but full of infinite possibility. I'd tell her that being loved for who you are is worth any risk. I'd tell her that safety without authenticity is just another kind of prison. I opened my eyes and looked at Dr. Stone. I'd tell her that she's already enough, exactly as she is. And what would you tell yourself now? The answer came to me like lightning, Sudden and illuminating and absolutely terrifying. I'd tell myself it's not too late to choose again. Dr. Warstone smiled, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe deeply. Like the walls of my perfectly controlled life had cracked just enough to let in a sliver of light. Sarah, I want you to think about something between now and our next session. You're about to become a mother. What kind of woman do you want your child to see when they look at you? What kind of life do you want to model for them? As I left her office and walked through the busy Manhattan streets toward the parking garage where my driver waited, I thought about my unborn child. Boy or girl, they would need a mother who was strong enough to protect them, brave enough to choose love over fear, wise enough to know the difference between safety and imprisonment. They would need a mother who remembered who she was before the world told her who she should be. For the first time in 20 years, I started to remember that woman, and I realized with crystalline clarity that she was still there, buried beneath decades of careful conditioning, waiting for permission to resurface. The invitation to the Metropolitan Museum Gala was waiting on my desk when I got home that afternoon, elegant and expensive, and holding the power to change everything. 3 weeks later, the mail changed everything. I was standing in our sun-drenched kitchen, arranging white roses in a crystal vase while mentally preparing for another day of pretending my marriage wasn't slowly suffocating me, when Maria brought in the afternoon mail. The thick, cream-colored envelope stood out among the usual bills and catalogs, like a whisper of something significant. The return address made my hands tremble. The Carter Foundation, James's foundation. I set down the roses and stared at the envelope, my heart hammering against my ribs. In 20 years of living in New York social circles, Richard and I had never received an invitation to a Carter Foundation event. James's philanthropy focused on education and poverty reduction, causes that didn't align with Richard's business interests or social ambitions. The sound of paper rustling seemed unnaturally loud as I opened the envelope and read the elegant script. The Carter Foundation cordially invites you to the annual Metropolitan Museum Gala, supporting literacy programs for underserved children. Saturday, October 15th, 7 o'clock, black tie, hosted by James Carter. My phone rang before I could fully process the implications. Richard's number flashed on the screen, and I answered without thinking. Sarah, did you get it? His voice was sharp with excitement, a tone I'd learned to associate with new business opportunities. Get what? I asked, though I knew exactly what he meant. The invitation to the Carter Foundation Gala. Margaret Morrison just called me. Apparently half the city received invitations today. This is huge. Sarah, this could be exactly what I need to get Carter's attention for the Midtown Development Project. I sank onto one of our leather bar stools, feeling suddenly dizzy. Of course, Richard would see this as a business opportunity rather than the emotional minefield it actually was. Richard, you don't think what, Sarah? Do you understand what this means? James Carter is worth $8 billion. $8 billion? If I can get him interested in the Morrison development, we're talking about $100 million project. Maybe more. The numbers meant nothing to me. Richard was already worth more than we could spend in 3 lifetimes. But I understood that for him, it wasn't about the money anymore. It was about power, prestige, the addiction of always reaching for more. I need to tell you something, I said quietly, my free hand instinctively moving to my belly, now obviously rounded at 20 weeks pregnant. What? Make it quick, I'm already late for the Henderson meeting. I took a deep breath, tasting fear and courage in equal measure. I knew James Carter in college. We dated for 3 years. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long, I wondered if the call had dropped. Then Richard's voice came back, cold and dangerous in a way that made my stomach clench. You dated James Carter? Yes, we broke up when we graduated. I haven't spoken to him since. You dated James Carter, and you never told me? His voice was getting quieter, which I'd learned over the years was far more frightening than when he yelled. In 20 years of marriage, you never mentioned that you had a relationship with one of the most powerful men in New York. It was a long time ago, Richard. It didn't seem relevant. Didn't seem relevant. The explosion came then, his voice rising to a shout that made me hold the phone away from my ear. Sarah, I've been trying to get a meeting with Carter for 5 years. 5 years of networking and connections and carefully crafted introductions. and you've had a direct line to him this entire time. It's not like that. We haven't spoken in decades. I have no idea if he even remembers me. Of course he remembers you. Men don't forget women like you. Sarah, beautiful, intelligent, from the right kind of family. You're exactly the kind of woman billionaires collect. The words stung more than they should have. Was that how Richard saw me? As a collectible, a trophy he'd acquired before James could claim me. Richard, you're overreacting. It was college. We were kids. Kids who dated for 3 years. Kids who probably talked about marriage, about futures, about dreams. I could hear him pacing now, his footsteps sharp against the hardwood floors of his office. Tell me the truth. Sarah, did he ask you to marry him? The question hit like a physical blow. I closed my eyes and remembered James's shy smile as he showed me the ring he'd picked out for Christmas of our senior year. Not an engagement ring, he'd said, but a promise ring, a symbol of the future he hoped we'd build together. Sarah, answer me. He talked about it. We talked about it. But Richard, that was 22 years ago. I chose you. I married you. I've spent 2 decades building a life with you. And now he's invited us to his gala, both of us. Don't you find that interesting? I hadn't thought about it that way. The invitation had been addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Richard Mitchell. James knew I was married. He'd obviously known for years, perhaps decades. The thought made me feel exposed, vulnerable, like he'd been watching my life from a distance, while I remained completely unaware of his. Maybe it's just a coincidence. Maybe he invites everyone in our social circle. Richard's laugh was bitter and sharp. Sarah, you're many things, but naive isn't one of them. Or it shouldn't be after 20 years of marriage to me. Nothing James Carter does is coincidental. He's built a business empire worth billions by being strategic about every move he makes. If he's inviting us to his gala, it's because he wants something. What could he possibly want from us? From us, nothing. From you. Richard's voice dropped to that dangerously quiet tone again. That remains to be seen. The line went dead, leaving me alone in our perfect kitchen with the invitation still clutched in my trembling hands. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see our manicured gardens, the swimming pool Richard had installed to impress business associates, the tennis court I'd never learned to use properly. Everything was beautiful and expensive and hollow. I thought about James, about the boy I'd loved with the fierce certainty of youth. The man who'd grown into one of the most successful philanthropists in the world while maintaining the kindness and integrity that had first attracted me to him. The man who'd never married, according to the occasional society page mentions I'd glimpsed over the years. My phone buzzed with a text from Richard. We're going to the gala. Buy something stunning. This is business. Everything was business with Richard. Our marriage was business. My pregnancy was business. Even my past love affair was just another asset to be leveraged for his benefit. I walked slowly upstairs to our bedroom, my hand trailing along the marble banister Richard had imported from Italy at enormous expense. In our walk-in closet, I stood among hundreds of designer dresses and thought about the girl I'd been in college. The girl who'd owned 3 good dresses and hadn't cared about fashion or status or making the right impression. The girl who'd believed that love was the most important thing in the world. That evening, Richard came home with champagne and apologies. His mood completely transformed. He swept me into his arms and spun me around our foyer, talking excitedly about the opportunities the gala represented. This could be exactly what we need to take the business to the next level, he said, kissing my forehead as he set me down. Sarah, you might have just given us the key to everything we've worked for. But as he held me close, talking about million-dollar deals and business connections, I realized that he hadn't once asked how I felt about seeing James again. He hadn't wondered if it might be difficult for me, emotionally complicated, potentially painful. To Richard, I wasn't a person with feelings and history and complicated emotions. I was a business asset whose value had just increased dramatically. And for the first time in 20 years, that distinction felt like the most important thing in the world. The next month passed like preparing for war. Though I was the only one who seemed to understand we were heading into battle, Richard threw himself into preparations with the focused intensity he usually reserved for hostile takeovers. He hired a team of investigators to research every detail of James's business interests, social connections, and philanthropic priorities. Our dining room table disappeared under stacks of reports about Carter Foundation initiatives, potential partnership opportunities, and strategic networking approaches. Knowledge is power, he told me over breakfast one morning, barely looking up from a thick folder labeled Carter Industries Complete Financial Analysis. By the time we walk into that gala, I'll know more about his business than most of his own executives do. I watched him make notes in the margins, his handwriting sharp and aggressive, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. This wasn't preparation, this was obsession. Meanwhile, I had my own preparations to make. At 24 weeks pregnant, my body was changing in ways that couldn't be hidden by strategic draping anymore. I needed a dress that would accommodate my growing belly while still meeting Richard's exacting standards for public appearances. "You need to look stunning," he'd told me the night before our shopping expedition to Bergdorf Goodman, "but not so stunning that you outshine the business opportunity. Elegant, sophisticated, but approachable. Beautiful enough to catch Carter's attention, but not so beautiful that other wives see you as a threat." The instructions made my head spin. I was supposed to be a delicate balance of attractiveness and invisibility. Impressive enough to open doors, but not so impressive that I became the focus of attention myself. It was a calculation I'd been making for 20 years. The careful mathematics of being Richard's wife. Linda flew in from California to help me shop, claiming she needed a vacation, but really coming because she heard something in my voice during our weekly phone calls that worried her. We spent an afternoon wandering through the luxury boutiques of Fifth Avenue, surrounded by saleswomen who treated us like visiting royalty the moment they recognized Richard's name on my credit cards. "Honey, you're glowing," Linda said as I tried on the seventh dress of the day, a midnight blue silk creation that flowed beautifully over my pregnant curves. "I know you're nervous about this gala, but you look absolutely radiant." I studied myself in the three-way mirror, seeing a woman I barely recognized. The dress was stunning, expensive enough to make me wince at the price tag, cut perfectly to showcase what Richard called my assets while diplomatically concealing my pregnancy. I looked like exactly what I was, a rich man's wife, carefully groomed and strategically presented. "Do you think I'm making a mistake?" I asked Linda, my voice barely above a whisper so the hovering saleswomen couldn't hear. "About the dress, absolutely not. It's perfect. Not about the dress, about seeing James again." Linda was quiet for a moment, studying my reflection with the careful attention she usually reserved for her therapy clients. "Sarah, can I ask you something? And I want you to really think about your answer." I nodded, meeting her eyes in the mirror. "Are you going to this gala as Richard's wife, or are you going as yourself?" The question hit me like a physical blow. I stared at my reflection, trying to see past the expensive dress and perfect makeup to the woman underneath. Who was that woman after 20 years of being Mrs. Richard Mitchell? Did she even exist anymore? "I don't know," I admitted. "Then maybe it's time to find out." That evening, Richard and I attended a dinner party at the Henderson's penthouse, where the upcoming Carter Foundation Gala was the only topic of conversation. I sat at their polished mahogany table, listening to the wives speculate about guest lists and auction items while the men discussed business opportunities and strategic networking. "I heard Margaret Carter will be there," said Patricia Henderson, her diamond earrings catching the candlelight as she leaned forward conspiratorially. "She's quite formidable, built half the cultural institutions in the city, and very protective of her son," added Caroline Morrison, swirling her wine with practiced elegance. "I've seen her destroy social climbers with a single well-placed comment. James has never married, has he?" This from Amanda Wells, whose own recent divorce from a pharmaceutical heir had been the subject of months of gossip. "At 45, you'd think he'd have settled down by now." "Men like that don't marry unless they find exactly what they're looking for," Richard said, his voice carrying across the table with authority. "When you have that much money and power, you can afford to be selective." I felt his eyes on me as he spoke, and something cold settled in my stomach. There was calculation in his gaze, the same expression he wore when evaluating a property for its development potential. After dinner, the men retreated to the library for cigars and business talk, while the women gathered in the sitting room for coffee and gossip. I found myself standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the glittering lights of Manhattan and thinking about choices. You're very quiet tonight. Sarah, Caroline Morrison observed, settling beside me with her coffee cup balanced perfectly on its saucer. Are you feeling all right? You look a bit pale. Just tired, I said, my hand instinctively moving to my belly. At 6 months pregnant, the fatigue was constant, but it wasn't physical exhaustion that was wearing me down. It was the emotional weight of pretending to be someone I'd never really been. The pregnancy must be taking its toll, Amanda said with the particular sympathy of someone who'd never experienced it herself. Richard must be thrilled about becoming a father. Yes, I said automatically. He's very excited. But even as I said the words, I realized how rarely Richard talked about the baby anymore. His initial enthusiasm had faded as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by his obsession with the Gala and the business opportunities it represented. When he looked at me now, I wasn't sure if he saw his pregnant wife or simply another asset in his strategic portfolio. Has he picked out names yet? Patricia asked. Men always have such strong opinions about names. We're still discussing it, I said, though the truth was we'd barely discussed it at all. Richard seemed to view the pregnancy as something happening to me rather than something we were experiencing together. Later that night, as we rode home in silence through the city streets, Richard finally spoke. You were quiet at dinner. I was tired. You can't be tired at the gala. Sarah, this is too important. There will be reporters, photographers, influential people who could impact our future. You need to be at your best. I turned to look at him in the dim light of the car's interior. Richard, what if James doesn't remember me the way you think he does? What if this whole strategy backfires? It won't. His certainty was absolute, unshakable. Trust me, Sarah. I know how men think. I know how successful men think. He's never forgotten you. How can you be so sure? Richard smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Because if I were him, I never would have forgotten you either. The words should have been romantic, but they felt like a threat. Like a warning about what would happen if James Carter turned out to be interested in reclaiming something Richard considered his property. As we pulled into our circular driveway, I caught sight of my reflection in the car window and saw a stranger staring back at me. A beautiful, well-dressed stranger with sad eyes and a carefully constructed life that felt like a cage. In less than 2 weeks, I would see James Carter again for the first time in 22 years. I would stand in the same room with the man I'd loved and lost and the man I'd married and learned to fear. And for reasons I couldn't yet articulate, I knew that night would change everything. The night of the gala arrived like a thunderstorm, heavy with anticipation and the promise of destruction. I spent the afternoon at the salon, letting Richard's chosen team of professionals transform me into the perfect version of his wife. My hair was swept into an elegant chignon that showcased the diamond earrings he'd given me for our anniversary. My makeup was flawless, designed to enhance my natural beauty without appearing overdone. My nails were painted a classic nude that complemented the midnight blue dress hanging in our bedroom like a question mark. You look stunning, Mrs. Mitchell, said the stylist as she made final adjustments to my hair. Your husband is a very lucky man. I smiled and nodded, but the words felt hollow. Lucky suggested choice, agency, the possibility of loss. Richard didn't feel lucky to have me. He felt entitled to me, the way he felt entitled to his other expensive possessions. By the time I returned home, Richard was already dressed in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, pacing our bedroom while barking instructions into his phone about last-minute business details. He looked handsome and successful and completely focused on everything except the woman who was about to give birth to his child in 4 months. You're late, he said as I entered our room, barely glancing at me before returning to his call. I said nothing, just walked to our ensuite bathroom and began the careful process of transforming myself into the woman he needed me to be tonight. The dress fit perfectly, flowing over my pregnant curves like liquid silk. The jewelry he'd selected, diamonds and sapphires worth more than most people's houses, caught the light beautifully. The shoes were slightly lower than usual, a concession to my pregnancy that Richard had grudgingly approved. When I emerged from the bathroom, Richard finally looked at me with his full attention. Perfect, he said, but he wasn't looking at me the way a husband looks at his wife. He was looking at me the way an art dealer examines a painting he's about to sell. Absolutely perfect. The car ride to the Metropolitan Museum was tense with unspoken expectations. Richard had prepared me with a detailed briefing about the evening's strategy approach. James gradually. Let him make the first move. Be charming, but not overeager. Create opportunities for Richard to discuss business without appearing pushy. Remember, he said as our driver navigated the Manhattan traffic, this isn't about you. This isn't about your past with Carter. This is about our future, our family's future. I nodded and pressed my hands to my belly, feeling the baby kick as if responding to the tension in my voice. What kind of future were we really building? What kind of family required this level of calculation and manipulation? The Metropolitan Museum at night was transformed into something magical. Thousands of lights illuminated the neoclassical facade, and a red carpet stretched from the street to the entrance, lined with photographers and reporters documenting the arrival of New York's elite. Our car joined the line of limousines and luxury vehicles depositing their elegantly dressed passengers at the foot of the stairs. "Showtime," Richard murmured as our driver opened the door. The sound of camera flashes and shouted questions filled the air as we made our way up the red carpet. Richard's hand on my lower back was possessive, proprietary, guiding me forward with the confidence of a man who belonged in these circles. I smiled and nodded at the photographers, playing my part in the theater of wealth and influence. Inside, the museum had been transformed into a glittering wonderland. The great hall soared above us, filled with the sound of a live orchestra and the gentle murmur of 300 conversations. Waiters in white gloves moved through the crowd carrying trays of champagne and canapes. Flowers, thousands of white roses and orchids, filled every available space with their subtle fragrance. And there, standing near the base of the grand staircase, greeting guests with his mother at his side, was James Carter. 22 years had been kind to him. The awkward college boy I'd remembered had grown into a man of quiet confidence and undeniable presence. His dark hair was touched with silver at the temples, and his face had gained the kind of character that only comes with age and experience. He was taller than I remembered, broader in the shoulders, but his smile was exactly the same, warm and genuine, and completely without pretense. He was greeting guests with the practiced ease of someone born to wealth but raised with humility. I watched him shake hands with senators and socialites, his attention fully focused on each person as if they were the only one in the room who mattered. "There he is," Richard murmured in my ear. "Our ticket to the big leagues." I wanted to tell him that James Carter wasn't a ticket to anything, that he was a human being with feelings and history and a heart I'd once broken. But Richard was already moving forward, navigating the crowd with predatory precision. "Mr. Carter," Richard said as we approached, his voice carrying the perfect blend of respect and confidence. "Richard Mitchell. We spoke briefly at the Morrison charity auction last spring." James turned toward us, and for a moment his polite expression didn't change. Then his eyes found mine, and I watched recognition dawn across his features like sunrise. "Sarah," he said, my name coming out as barely more than a whisper. "Sarah Wilson." "Sarah Mitchell now," Richard corrected smoothly, his arm tightening around my waist. "My wife." James's gaze flickered between us, and I saw something shift in his expression, surprise, confusion, and something else I couldn't quite identify. "Of course. Congratulations on your marriage." "Thank you," I managed to say, my voice steadier than I'd expected. "Congratulations on all your success. The foundation does incredible work." "Thank you. He paused, seeming to struggle for words in a way that was completely unlike the confident philanthropist I'd watched working the room moments before. "I had no idea you were in New York. It's wonderful to see you." Margaret Carter appeared at her son's elbow, her sharp eyes taking in our little group with obvious interest. "James, darling, you're neglecting your other guests." "Mother, I'd like you to meet Sarah Mitchell and her husband Richard. Sarah and I knew each other in college." Margaret's gaze lingered on my face for a moment longer than was strictly polite. "How lovely. Welcome to our little gathering." The conversation continued for another few minutes, polite and surface level and charged with undercurrents I'm sure only James and I could feel. Richard monopolized most of the talking, steering the discussion toward business opportunities and mutual acquaintances with the skill of a practiced networker. I stood there in my midnight blue dress, my hand resting on my pregnant belly, watching the two men who had shaped my life most profoundly shake hands and exchange business cards as if this were just another networking opportunity. But I saw the way James's eyes kept returning to my face, searching for traces of the girl he'd once loved. I saw the way his smile became slightly forced when Richard mentioned our 20-year marriage and our expected child. I saw the moment he realized that the woman he'd once asked to marry him had spent the past 2 decades building a life with another man. Perhaps we could continue this conversation later, Richard said as Margaret began to guide James toward another group of waiting guests. I'd love to discuss some potential collaboration opportunities. Of course, James replied, but he was looking at me as he said it. I hope you enjoy the evening, Sarah, both of you. As he moved away, I felt something inside me break, not the sharp crack of sudden trauma, but the slow, inevitable crumbling of a wall I'd spent 20 years building around my heart. That went perfectly, Richard said in my ear, his voice warm with satisfaction. Did you see the way he looked at you? We're going to get everything we want from this. But as I watched James disappear into the crowd, greeting other guests with that same warm smile while Margaret watched me from across the room with calculating eyes, I realized that what Richard wanted and what I needed had never been the same thing. And tonight, that difference was going to matter more than either of us could have imagined. As the evening deepened, so did the danger I couldn't yet see approaching. The gala flowed around us like an elaborate dance, with Richard leading me from conversation to conversation, introducing me to potential business partners and their wives as if I were another impressive acquisition to display. He was in his element, charming and confident, working the room with the practiced ease of someone who understood that relationships were just another form of currency. I smiled and nodded and made appropriate small talk, but part of me remained aware of James moving through the crowd across the ballroom. Every few minutes, our eyes would meet across the sea of elegant guests, and I'd feel that familiar flutter of recognition, of possibility, of roads not taken. You're distracted, Richard murmured during a brief break between conversations. We stood near one of the massive flower arrangements, champagne glasses in our hands, watching the orchestra prepare for the next set. I'm tired, the baby. I placed my free hand on my belly, using my pregnancy as an excuse the way I'd learned to do over the past months. We can't leave yet. I haven't had a real chance to talk to Carter about the Morrison project. His grip on my elbow tightened slightly. And I noticed he keeps looking over here. You still have his attention. The words made my stomach clench with anxiety, and something else, a growing awareness that Richard saw my history with James, not as a complication to navigate, but as an advantage to exploit. I need to use the restroom, I said, pulling away from his grip. Don't be long. The auction starts in 20 minutes, and I want to be back in position before. I'll be right back, I interrupted, already walking away before he could finish giving me instructions. The ladies' room in the museum was a marble sanctuary, echoing with the soft sounds of running water and hushed conversations. I stood at the sinks, staring at my reflection in the mirror, trying to recognize the woman looking back at me. She was beautiful, expensively dressed, perfectly groomed. She was also completely lost. You look exactly as I remember you. I turned to find Margaret Carter emerging from one of the stalls, her silver hair impeccable and her shrewd eyes focused on my face with laser precision. Mrs. Carter, I didn't realize you were... Please, call me Margaret. We're practically family, after all. She moved to the sink beside mine, washing her hands with careful attention. James talked about you for years after college. You know. The words hit me like a physical blow. He did, oh yes, he never said much, but a mother knows when her son is carrying a torch. She dried her hands on a thick towel, studying me in the mirror. I always wondered what happened to the girl who broke my son's heart. I didn't mean to. I started, then stopped. What could I say that I'd been young and scared and convinced I wasn't good enough for their world, that I'd chosen security over love and spent 20 years regretting it? You married someone else, Margaret continued, her voice matter-of-fact rather than accusatory. Someone safe, I imagine. Someone who wouldn't challenge you the way James would have. It wasn't like that. Wasn't it? She turned to face me directly, her expression kind but penetrating. My dear, I've lived 70 years in circles where women marry for security rather than love. I recognized the signs. I felt tears threatening and blinked them back. I was young. I made what seemed like the practical choice. And now, the question hung in the air between us like a challenge. Now, I was standing in a museum bathroom, 6 months pregnant, married to a man who saw me as a business asset, about to return to a ballroom where my first love was hosting a charity gala, and my husband was planning to use our shared history for his own financial gain. Now, I'm not sure I know the difference between practical and cowardly anymore, I admitted. Margaret smiled, and for the first time that evening, I saw where James had inherited his warmth. That's the first step toward wisdom. Sarah, understanding that what we call practical is often just fear wearing a more respectable costume. But it's too late now. I'm married. I'm having Richard's baby. I've built a life with him. Have you, or have you simply been living the life he built around you? The question was too close to truths I wasn't ready to face. I turned back to the mirror, pretending to check my lipstick while trying to compose myself. James never married, Margaret said quietly. He had relationships, of course, some quite serious, but whenever anyone asked him about settling down, he'd say his heart belonged to someone else. My hands shook as I applied fresh lipstick. Mrs. Carter Margaret, I think you're misunderstanding. He built an empire thinking of you? Sarah, every success, every achievement, every charitable foundation part of him was trying to become worthy of the woman who chose someone else. I turned to stare at her, lipstick frozen halfway to my mouth. That's not possible, isn't it? What do you think drove him to such extraordinary success? He could have been content managing the family foundation, living quietly on his trust fund. Instead, he built something magnificent, something that would have impressed even a practical young woman who was afraid of being loved too much. The bathroom door opened, and two other women entered, their conversation about auction items and charity donations filling the space with normal, safe chatter. Margaret moved toward the door, then paused. Sarah, may I give you some advice from one woman to another? I nodded, not trusting my voice. Sometimes the most practical thing we can do is stop being practical. Sometimes the most responsible choice is to choose happiness over security. She touched my arm gently. And sometimes it's not too late to correct old mistakes, even when we think it is. Then she was gone, leaving me alone with the other women and the echo of possibilities I'd thought were buried forever. I returned to the ballroom in a daze, my mind reeling from Margaret's revelations. Richard was waiting exactly where I'd left him, his impatience visible in the tight line of his jaw. Finally, I was beginning to think you'd fallen in. He took my arm possessively. The auction's about to start. We need to position ourselves where Carter can see us participating. As we found seats at one of the elegantly appointed tables, I caught sight of James at the front of the room, preparing to address the crowd. He looked confident and commanding as he approached the microphone, but I noticed the way his eyes swept the room until they found mine. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice carrying easily across the ballroom. Welcome to the 15th Annual Carter Foundation Gala. Tonight, we're here to support literacy programs that have already changed the lives of over 50,000 children in underserved communities across the country. The crowd applauded politely, but I barely heard them. I was watching James's face, seeing the passion and commitment there, the genuine care for the cause he was championing. This wasn't networking or social climbing. This was a man who had found purpose in using his privilege to lift others up. When had Richard ever spoken about anything with that kind of authentic passion? Our goal tonight is ambitious, James continued. We hope to raise $2 million to expand our programs to 10 additional cities. Every dollar you contribute will directly impact a child's ability to read, to learn, to dream of possibilities beyond their current circumstances. The auction began, and I watched in fascination as James masterfully worked the crowd, his charm and sincerity encouraging increasingly generous bids for everything from vacation packages to original artwork. Richard bid aggressively on several items, clearly trying to establish himself as a serious player in the room. $50,000 for the Hamptons house rental, he called out, raising his paddle with theatrical flair. Excellent bid from Mr. Mitchell, James acknowledged from the stage, his eyes finding mine across the crowded room. Do I hear 60? The bidding continued, but I found myself studying James's face, looking for traces of the boy I'd loved in the confident man commanding the stage. He was there. I realized the kindness, the integrity, the quiet strength that had first attracted me, they'd all grown and matured, but they were still fundamentally the same. What had I become in the same years? What had I grown into? And what had I allowed to be pruned away? $200,000, called a voice from the back of the room, and the crowd turned to see who had made such an extravagant bid. Remarkable generosity, James said, but his attention was clearly elsewhere now. I followed his gaze and saw that he was looking at our table, where Richard sat with obvious satisfaction at having made the highest bid of the evening. Sold to Mr. Mitchell for $200,000, James announced. An extraordinary contribution to an extraordinary cause. The applause was thunderous, but I felt sick. Richard had just spent more money than most people earned in several years, not out of generosity or commitment to literacy, but as a display of wealth designed to impress James Carter. As the auction concluded and the dancing began, Richard was in his element, accepting congratulations and making connections with other major donors. But I noticed that James hadn't approached our table, despite Richard's obvious attempts to catch his attention. "Why isn't he coming over?" Richard muttered, his frustration beginning to show. "I just gave him the biggest donation of the night." "Maybe he's busy with other guests," I suggested, though I suspected James was avoiding us for entirely different reasons. "No, this is about you, Sarah. He's playing hard to get because he knows you're here with me." Richard's voice was getting that dangerous quiet quality that meant his anger was building. "He wants to make me work for his attention." "Richard, that's not—" "Don't tell me what it's not. I know how men think. I know what he's doing." He stood abruptly, straightening his tuxedo jacket. "If he wants to play games, we'll play games. Come on. Where are we going?" To remind James Carter exactly what he lost when he lost you. He pulled me to my feet and guided me toward the dance floor, where other couples swayed to the orchestra's romantic music. But Richard wasn't interested in romance. This was strategy, performance, a calculated display designed to provoke a reaction. "Smile," he commanded as he spun me onto the dance floor. "Look happy. Look like you're in love with your husband." I tried to comply, but the effort felt enormous. How did you pretend to be in love when you were beginning to understand that you'd never really known what love was supposed to feel like? As we danced, I caught glimpses of James across the room, talking with donors and foundation staff, his attention apparently focused entirely on his hosting duties. But several times I felt his eyes on us, watching Richard hold me possessively close, watching me smile and nod and play the part of the devoted wife. "He's watching," Richard said with satisfaction. "He can't take his eyes off you." But when I looked, James was turning away, his expression unreadable, walking toward the exit with long, determined strides. "He's leaving," I said, not sure why that felt like such a loss. "Good," Richard replied. "Let him leave wanting what he can't have. Let him spend the night thinking about what could have been." As the music swelled around us and Richard held me tighter, I realized that James Carter wasn't the only one who would spend the night thinking about what could have been. The difference was that for me, those thoughts were becoming less about the past and more about a future I was finally brave enough to imagine. Everything I'd buried for 20 years surfaced in one moment when Richard's hand connected with my cheek. The evening had been building toward this confrontation for hours, though I'd been too naive to see it coming. After James left the ballroom, Richard's mood had grown increasingly dark. He'd consumed too much champagne. His careful networking facade had begun to slip, and his frustration at not getting the business meeting he'd orchestrated had transformed into something uglier. "You did this on purpose," he hissed as we stood near the museum's marble staircase, surrounded by the gentle murmur of other guests enjoying the final hour of the gala. "You warned him away from me somehow." "Richard, that's ridiculous. I barely spoke to him." "Don't lie to me, Sarah. I saw the way you looked at him. I saw the way he looked at you. You still have feelings for him." The accusation hung between us like a blade. Around us, New York's elite continued their conversations about art and charity and social connections, oblivious to the drama unfolding in their midst. "I'm 6 months pregnant with your child," I said quietly, my hand moving instinctively to my belly. "We're at a charity gala. Can we please discuss this at home?" "Home?" Richard's laugh was bitter and sharp. "You mean the home I built for us, the life I created for us, the security and status I've given you for 20 years. His voice was rising now, drawing glances from nearby guests. I could see Margaret Carter across the room, her sharp eyes focused on our conversation with obvious concern. Richard, please. People are watching. Let them watch. Let them see what happens when a wife betrays her husband's trust. I haven't betrayed anything. I've been the perfect wife for 20 years. I've supported your career, hosted your business dinners, smiled at your colleagues, played whatever part you needed me to play. My own voice was getting stronger now, powered by months of accumulated resentment and Dr. Stone's careful encouragement to find my voice. I've given you everything you've asked for. Everything except honesty. You never told me about Carter. In 20 years of marriage, you never mentioned that you'd been involved with one of the most powerful men in New York. Because it didn't matter. It was over before it began. I chose you, Richard. I chose our life together. And now he's back. And suddenly you're questioning that choice. The words hit too close to home, and Richard saw the truth in my face before I could hide it. I knew it, he said, his voice dropping to that dangerous whisper that had become the soundtrack of my fears. You're thinking about what your life would have been like if you'd chosen differently. Everyone thinks about paths not taken. Richard, that's human nature. Not my wife. My wife doesn't look at other men and wonder what if. My wife doesn't embarrass me in public by making it obvious she's having second thoughts about our marriage. I haven't embarrassed you. I've barely spoken to anyone but you all evening. You didn't need to speak. The way you looked at him said everything. The way you lit up when you saw him. The way you hung on his every word during the auction. Do you think I'm blind? A small crowd was beginning to gather around us now, drawn by the escalating tension and Richard's increasingly raised voice. I caught sight of familiar faces from our social circle. Women I'd known for years watching our private drama unfold with the fascination reserved for car accidents and celebrity scandals. Richard, we need to stop this. We need to go home and discuss this privately. Privately, you mean where you can lie to me more effectively, where you can pretend you're not having fantasies about your billionaire ex-boyfriend. The cruel emphasis he put on the words made several nearby guests gasp. I felt my cheeks burn with humiliation, not just at his public accusations, but at the realization that my husband was willing to destroy my reputation to prove a point. That's enough, I said firmly. We're leaving now. I turned to walk toward the coat check, desperate to escape the growing spectacle, but Richard grabbed my arm and spun me back to face him. Don't you walk away from me. Sarah, don't you dare walk away from me when I'm talking to you. Let go of me. My voice was steady despite the fear crawling up my spine. You're hurting me. I'm hurting you. You want to know what hurting feels like? Try spending 20 years building something with someone, only to discover they've been keeping secrets that could destroy everything you've worked for. I haven't kept secrets. I haven't destroyed anything. Richard, you're drunk and you're being irrational. People are staring. Good. Let them stare. Let them see what happens when a man discovers his wife has been lying to him for decades. That's when I saw James approaching through the crowd, his face grim with concern and determination. Behind him, Margaret Carter followed with several other men I didn't recognize, all of them moving toward our confrontation with obvious intent. Is everything all right here? James's voice cut through the tension like a knife, calm but carrying an authority that made conversations stop and heads turn. Everything's fine. Carter, Richard snarled, but he didn't release his grip on my arm. Just having a discussion with my wife. It doesn't look like a discussion from where I'm standing. James stepped closer, close enough that I could see the controlled anger in his eyes. It looks like you're manhandling a pregnant woman in public. What I do with my wife is none of your business. It becomes my business when you do it at my charity gala, in front of my guests, in my museum. The possessive emphasis James put on my wasn't lost on Richard, whose face flushed red with rage and humiliation. Your museum, your guests. You think because you have money, you can tell other men how to handle their wives. I think any decent man knows better than to grab a pregnant woman hard enough to leave bruises. I looked down at my arm and saw that James was right. Richard's fingers had left red marks on my skin, clearly visible against the pale silk of my dress. Richard, I said quietly, please let go of me. Not until we settle this. Not until you admit what this is really about. What is really about? Your regret, your second thoughts, Your fantasy about what your life would have been like if you'd married him instead of me? The words exploded out of him with 20 years of accumulated insecurity and resentment. Around us, the crowd had grown larger, more interested, more invested in watching our private pain become public spectacle. You want to know the truth, Richard continued, his voice rising to near shouting level. You want to know what you really gave up. Look around you, Sarah. Look at what he's built. Look at what he's become. Billions of dollars, international respect, philanthropic influence. And what did you get instead? A millionaire real estate developer from Queens who had to fight for everything he got. Richard, stop. No, I won't stop. You think he's better than me. You think you made the wrong choice. You think you settled for damaged goods. That's not true, isn't it? Then why can't you look at me the way you looked at him tonight? Why can't you smile at me the way you smiled at him? The pain in his voice was real, and for a moment I almost felt sorry for him. Almost understood that beneath his anger and control was a deep well of insecurity about never being enough, never being worthy of the life he'd built for himself. But then his grip tightened on my arm, and his face twisted with rage, and I saw the man he really was beneath all the expensive suits and careful charm. You embarrassed me in front of everyone, he said, his voice low and dangerous. You made me look like a fool. I didn't do anything except stand here and listen to you humiliate both of us. You think he wants damaged goods? Richard's voice rose again, carrying across the marble hall like a gunshot. You think your perfect billionaire wants a woman who's carrying another man's child? And that's when he hit me. The sharp crack of his palm against my cheek echoed through the museum like thunder. The sound seemed to suspend time, freezing 300 guests in shocked silence as my champagne glass slipped from my nerveless fingers and shattered against the marble floor. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The orchestra stopped playing mid-note, and the gentle murmur of conversation died into absolute stillness. I touched my burning cheek, feeling the sting radiate through my face while Richard stared at his own hand as if he couldn't believe what he'd just done. My God, Margaret Carter's voice cut through the silence like a blade. Security, remove this man from the premises immediately. But James was already moving, stepping between Richard and me with lethal grace, his face cold with controlled fury. You need to leave, he said quietly, but his voice carried to every corner of the silent ballroom. Now! This is between my wife and me, Richard said, but his bluster was cracking now, his businessman's instincts finally recognizing that he'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The only thing between you and your wife now is a restraining order, James replied, his voice deadly calm. Security is already on their way. You can leave voluntarily, or you can be escorted out in handcuffs. Your choice. I stood there in the center of the silent ballroom, one hand pressed to my burning cheek, the other protectively covering my belly, surrounded by the shattered remains of my champagne flute and my 20-year marriage. 300 of New York's most influential people watched in a stunned fascination as my carefully constructed life collapsed in real time. Sarah. Richard's voice was different now, smaller, desperate. Sarah, I'm sorry. I didn't mean. I've never. This isn't who I am. But it was who he was. It was who he'd always been beneath the expensive suits and charitable donations and business success. It was the man who'd spent 20 years slowly eroding my sense of self until I'd almost forgotten I had value beyond what I could provide for him. Don't you ever touch me again, I said, my voice trembling but clear. The words came from somewhere deep inside me, from the part of myself I'd thought was lost forever. You don't understand, Richard said, reaching toward me again. You don't understand what you're throwing away. James stepped forward, blocking Richard's path with his body. She understands perfectly. The question is whether you do. 2 security guards in black suits appeared at Richard's elbows, their presence professional but unmistakably threatening. Around us, the crowd watched with the fascination reserved for disasters and revelations. Mr. Mitchell, one of the guards said politely, we need you to come with us. This is ridiculous, Richard said, but his fight was gone now, replaced by the hollow panic of a man watching his carefully constructed image crumble. Sarah, tell them, Tell them this is just a misunderstanding between husband and wife. I looked at him, really looked at him for what felt like the first time in years. I saw the weakness beneath his bluster, the insecurity beneath his control, the fear beneath his anger. I saw a man who'd built his entire sense of self on the illusion of power over others, and I realized that I'd been complicit in that illusion for 2 decades. The only misunderstanding, I said clearly, my voice carrying across the silent ballroom, is a grown man thinking he owns another human being. The crowd murmured its approval, a sound like wind through leaves. Several women stepped forward, creating a protective circle around me without being asked. Margaret Carter appeared at my side, her presence both comforting and formidable. "You'll regret this," Richard said as the security guards began to guide him toward the exit. "You'll come crawling back when you realize what you've thrown away. You'll realize that nobody else will want you. Nobody else will take care of you the way I have." "The only thing I'm throwing away," I replied, my voice growing stronger with each word, "is 20 years of pretending to be someone I'm not." And then he was gone, swallowed by the marble corridors of the museum, his shouts of protest fading into the distance. The security guards disappeared with him, leaving me standing in the sudden silence of the ballroom with 300 witnesses and the man I'd never stopped loving. James approached me carefully, as if I were a wounded animal that might flee at sudden movement. "Sarah," he said softly, "are you hurt? Do you need medical attention?" I laughed, but it came out more like a sob. "I need a lot of things. Medical attention is probably the least of them." Margaret Carter appeared with a chair, and several people helped me sit down. Someone brought me water. Someone else found ice for my cheek. The crowd began to disperse slowly, conversations resuming in hushed tones as the evening attempted to return to normal. But nothing would ever be normal again. I just destroyed my marriage in front of 300 witnesses. I just walked away from 20 years of financial security and social status. I was 6 months pregnant with nowhere to go and no plan for what came next. And for the first time in decades, I felt free. "I called my doctor," James said, kneeling beside my chair. "She's on her way to check on you and the baby." "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did." His eyes were serious, concerned, filled with the same kindness I remembered from college. "Sarah, I need you to know that you don't have to worry about anything tonight. You don't have to go home with him. You don't have to be alone. Whatever you need, however I can help, just tell me." I looked at him through my tears, this man who'd grown into everything I'd once dreamed he could become, and realized that Margaret had been right. He'd never forgotten me, just as I'd never really forgotten him. "Why," I asked, "after all these years, after what I did to you, why would you help me?" James smiled, the same gentle smile that had first made me fall in love with him 23 years ago. "Because," he said simply, "some people are worth waiting for." In the quiet after the storm, truth became clear in ways I'd never allowed myself to see. James's private office in the museum was a sanctuary of warm wood and soft lighting, a stark contrast to the marble grandeur of the ballroom where my marriage had just ended in spectacular fashion. I sat in a leather chair that probably cost more than most people's cars, holding an ice pack to my cheek while Dr. Rachel Morrison, James's personal physician and, apparently, a close family friend examined the bruising on my arm. "The baby's heartbeat is strong," Dr. Morrison said as she packed away the portable ultrasound equipment she'd brought. "But I'm concerned about your stress levels. What you've been through tonight. It's not good for either of you." I nodded, my free hand resting on my belly, where our child, Richard's child, continued to grow, despite the chaos surrounding us. "What happens now, I mean, medically, if I leave him, if I'm on my own?" "You're not on your own," James said quietly from where he stood by the window, looking out at the city lights. He'd changed from his tuxedo into jeans and a sweater, somehow managing to look both more casual and more devastatingly handsome than he had in formal wear. "Sarah," Dr. Morrison said gently, "you're going to need support during the remainder of your pregnancy. Emotional support, practical support, and yes, financial support. Do you have family, friends, resources you can rely on?" The question exposed the reality of my situation with brutal clarity. Richard had systematically isolated me from most of my old friends over the years, claiming they weren't sophisticated enough for our new social circle. My parents had died in a car accident 5 years ago, and my only sibling lived in Oregon with a family of her own and little extra money. I have some saving, I said. Though even as I spoke the words, I realized how naive they sounded. Richard controlled our finances completely. My savings were whatever he allowed me to have in my personal account, which was enough for shopping and lunch with the ladies, but nowhere near enough to support a pregnant woman and newborn baby. Sarah, James said, turning from the window, you need to understand something about your financial situation. When you divorce Richard, you'll be entitled to half of everything he's accumulated during your marriage. Given his success over the past 20 years, that's a substantial sum. I don't want his money. It's not his money. It's your money. You've been his partner for 2 decades, supporting his career, hosting his business functions, playing the role that helped him build his empire. You earned that money as much as he did. Margaret Carter appeared in the doorway, carrying a tray with tea and sandwiches that no one had asked for, but everyone needed. James is right, dear. I've seen too many women walk away from marriages with nothing because they were too proud or too frightened to claim what was rightfully theirs. But I don't know how any of this works. I don't know about divorce lawyers or custody arrangements or, God, what if he tries to take the baby away from me? The fear had been growing in the back of my mind since the moment Richard's hand connected with my face. He was wealthy, well-connected, used to getting what he wanted through intimidation and manipulation. What did I have to fight him with? He won't, James said with absolute certainty. Not after what happened tonight. Not with 300 witnesses who saw him strike a pregnant woman in public. Those same 300 witnesses saw me humiliate him. They saw me destroy his reputation, ruin his business relationships. They saw a woman finally standing up to a narcissistic abuser, Margaret corrected firmly. And believe me, dear, every woman in that ballroom has either experienced what you experienced tonight or knows someone who has. You'll find more support than you expect. Dr. Morrison finished packing her medical bag and turned to face me directly. Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. Has he hit you before tonight? No? Never? The words came automatically. Then I paused. But there were other things. He controlled what I ate, what I wore, who I spent time with. He monitored my spending, read my emails, tracked my phone. He told me it was because he loved me, because he wanted to protect me. That's abuse, Dr. Morrison said gently. Physical violence is just one form of abuse. What you're describing is emotional and financial abuse, and it's just as damaging. The word still made me flinch, but hearing it from a medical professional somehow made it more real, more legitimate. Richard hadn't just hit me tonight. He'd been abusing me for years. What do I do now? I asked, the question encompassing everything from where I would sleep tonight to how I would rebuild my entire life. Tonight, you rest, Margaret said, settling into the chair across from me with the authority of someone accustomed to taking charge in crises. James has already arranged for you to stay in the guest suite at our apartment. Tomorrow, we'll connect you with the best divorce attorney in the city. Next week, you'll start planning for your future. I can't let you do that. I can't accept charity from people I barely know anymore. You're not accepting charity, James said, moving to sit in the chair beside mine. You're accepting help from someone who cares about you, someone who's cared about you for 23 years. The simple honesty of his words broke something open inside me, and I started crying, not the careful, controlled tears I'd perfected as Richard's wife, but deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from decades of suppressed emotion. James reached out hesitantly, then pulled me into his arms when I didn't resist. I cried against his shoulder while he held me carefully, as if I were made of spun glass, his hands stroking my hair the way he used to when we were young, and the world seemed full of infinite possibility. I'm so sorry, I whispered against his shoulder. I'm sorry for leaving you. I'm sorry for choosing him. I'm sorry for wasting 20 years of both our lives. You didn't waste anything, he said quietly. You made the choice that felt right at the time. We both learned things, grew in ways we needed to grow. Maybe we needed those 20 years to become the people who could make this work. I pulled back to look at his face, searching for any sign of resentment or anger or the bitter disappointment I probably deserved. Instead, I found the same steady kindness that had first made me fall in love with him. tempered now by the wisdom and confidence that came with age and success. James, I'm pregnant with another man's child. I'm about to go through a very public, very ugly divorce. I have no money, no career, no idea how to be anything other than someone's wife. Why would you want to help me? Why would you want to get involved in this mess? He smiled, reaching up to touch my uninjured cheek with gentle fingers. Because 23 years ago, I loved a brave, intelligent, compassionate woman who thought she wasn't good enough for the world she was afraid to enter. Tonight, I watched that same woman find the courage to walk away from a life that was destroying her, even when it meant giving up everything she thought she needed for security. I'm not brave. I'm terrified. Being brave doesn't mean not being terrified. It means being terrified and doing what's right anyway. Margaret cleared her throat delicately. If you two are quite finished being profound, I think Sarah needs to rest. It's been a long night, and she's going to need her strength for what comes next. Dr. Morrison left detailed instructions about monitoring my stress levels and watching for signs of pregnancy complications. Margaret disappeared to prepare the guest suite and coordinate with the security team about ensuring Richard couldn't access the building. James walked me through the quiet corridors of the museum to a private entrance where a car waited to take us to his family's Upper East Side apartment. As we rode through the empty streets of Manhattan, I stared out the window at the city lights and thought about choices. 23 years ago, I'd chosen security over love, certainty over possibility, fear over faith. Tonight, I'd chosen truth over comfort, authenticity over safety, love over fear. For the first time in decades, I had no idea what tomorrow would bring. But for the first time in decades, that uncertainty felt like freedom rather than terror. James, I said as we pulled up to his building, I need you to understand something. I don't know who I am anymore outside of being Richard's wife. I don't know what I want or what I'm capable of or what kind of life I want to build. I can't promise you anything except that I'll try to figure it out. He took my hand, his fingers warm and steady around mine. Sarah, I've waited 23 years to see who you'd become when you stopped trying to be what other people needed you to be. I can wait a little longer to see who you choose to become when you're finally free to be yourself. As we rode the elevator to his apartment, I felt something I'd almost forgotten hope. Not the desperate hope of someone clinging to illusions, but the quiet, steady hope of someone finally ready to face the truth about themselves and their life. Tomorrow would bring lawyers and difficult conversations and the complicated work of untangling 20 years of financial and emotional entanglement. Tomorrow would bring decisions about custody and support and where I would live and how I would support myself and my child. But tonight, for the first time in decades, I was exactly where I wanted to be. 6 months later, I learned what happiness sounds like. It sounds like a baby laughing, like footsteps on a path through Central Park on a perfect spring morning, like the gentle murmur of other parents pushing strollers and chasing toddlers while the city wakes up around them. I sat on a bench near the playground, watching James push Emma's stroller in slow circles while she gurgled and reached for the dancing shadows cast by the oak trees overhead. At 3 months old, she was perfect, 10 fingers, 10 toes, and her father's gray eyes that seemed to take in everything with serious concentration. She's going to be a scientist, James said, settling beside me on the bench as Emma finally dozed off in her stroller. Look at the way she studies everything. She's trying to figure out how the world works. She gets that from you, I said, adjusting the soft yellow blanket Margaret had knitted for her granddaughter, because that's what Margaret had become. Despite having no biological claim to either Emma or me, the curiosity, the intensity. She gets her stubbornness from her mother, James replied, grinning as he took my hand. Remember last week when she refused to sleep until you sang that lullaby 4 times in a row? I laughed, remembering Emma's imperious demands for exactly the right conditions for sleep. She knows what she wants. Like her mother. The words were gentle, but they carried weight. Over the past 6 months, I'd had to learn what I wanted, who I was beneath 20 years of being someone else's idea of the perfect wife. It had been harder than I'd expected, not the divorce, which had proceeded with surprising efficiency once Richard realized that fighting me publicly would only bring more attention to his assault at the Gala, but the process of discovering my own identity. Dr. Stone had warned me that leaving an abusive relationship was just the beginning. The real work came in rebuilding yourself, in learning to trust your own judgment, in developing the confidence to make decisions based on your own values rather than someone else's expectations. What are you thinking about? James asked, his thumb tracing circles on the back of my hand. About choices? About how different everything is now compared to 6 months ago? It really was different. I lived in my own apartment, now a beautiful two-bedroom on the Upper West Side that I'd chosen and furnished myself with money from the divorce settlement. Richard had been surprisingly generous, perhaps motivated by genuine remorse, or perhaps by his lawyer's advice that cooperation would serve him better than vindictiveness in the court of public opinion. I'd started seeing a therapist who specialized in helping women rebuild their lives after narcissistic abuse. I'd reconnected with Linda, who flew out from California every few weeks and had become Emma's unofficial godmother. I'd even begun exploring the possibility of returning to teaching, something I'd given up so long ago that it felt like remembering a dream. Most importantly, I'd learned to make decisions for myself. Where to live, how to spend my time, what kind of mother I wanted to be, what kind of relationship I wanted with James, all choices that were mine to make without having to consider someone else's agenda or expectations. Any regrets? James asked. I considered the question seriously. Regrets about leaving Richard, about the public spectacle of my marriage ending, about the months of legal complications and social awkwardness that had followed. No, I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. I regret waiting so long to leave, but I don't regret leaving. And about us. That was a more complicated question. James and I had been careful with each other, taking things slowly despite the obvious connection that had never really faded. We'd had dinner, long conversations, quiet evenings together while I was pregnant and adjusting to my new reality. We'd talked about the past, the choices we'd made, the people we'd become in the years apart. But we'd also been clear that I needed time to figure out who I was as an individual before I could be part of a couple again. James had been patient, supportive, present when I needed him, but never pressuring me to move faster than I was ready to move. I'm grateful, I said, for your patience, for your friendship, for the way you've let me find my own way without trying to direct the process. Very different from Richard's approach. Very different from Richard's approach. I agreed. A jogger ran past our bench, followed by a woman walking a small dog, followed by a group of teenagers laughing about something on one of their phones. Normal life, continuing around us while we sat in our bubble of contentment. Sarah, James said, his voice careful in the way that meant he was about to say something important. I have something to ask you. My stomach fluttered with nerves and anticipation. What? He turned to face me more fully, his expression serious but warm. I know we've been taking things slowly. I know you needed time to figure out who you are outside of being someone's wife. And I want you to know that whatever you decide, that's not going to change. You'll always be Emma's mother. You'll always be someone I care about. You'll always have my support. James. Let me finish. He smiled, reaching into his jacket pocket. I've been carrying this around for 3 weeks, waiting for the right moment. But I realize there's never going to be a perfect moment, a moment without complications or uncertainty or reasons to wait. He pulled out a small velvet box, and my heart stopped. I'm not asking you to marry me, he said quickly, seeing my expression. I'm not asking you to make any promises or commitments you're not ready to make. I'm asking if you'd consider wearing this as a symbol of possibility, of a future we might build together when you're ready. He opened the box to reveal a ring, not the elaborate diamond Richard had given me 20 years ago as a symbol of his success, but a simple band with a single stone that caught the morning light and threw rainbows across our joined hands. It's beautiful, I whispered. It's a promise, he said. Not a promise from you to me, but a promise from me to you. That I'll wait as long as you need me to wait. That I'll love you whether you wear this ring or not. That I'll be here for you and Emma, whether we're together romantically or just as friends who care about each other. I looked at the ring, then at his face, then at Emma sleeping peacefully in her stroller, her tiny fist curled around the edge of her blanket. This man had been patient through my pregnancy, supportive through my divorce, gentle with my healing, kind to my daughter who wasn't his biological child, but whom he treated with the tenderness of a devoted father. What would you like me to say? I asked. Whatever you're thinking, whatever you're feeling, whatever's true for you right now. I took the ring from the box and held it up to the light, watching it cast patterns of color across the path in front of us. 3 months ago, I would have been terrified of this. Not because I don't care about you, but because I was still learning how to make decisions without being afraid of making the wrong choice. And now I think the only wrong choice would be to let fear keep me from accepting something beautiful because it might not last forever. I slipped the ring onto my finger, feeling its weight settle against my skin like a promise kept. Yes, James. Yes to possibility. Yes to building something together. Yes to seeing what happens when two people choose love over fear. He kissed me then, soft and sweet and full of the kind of hope that survives decades of separation and heartbreak and difficult choices. Emma stirred in her stroller as if sensing the shift in the energy around her, opening her gray eyes to study our faces with that serious concentration that would probably characterize her entire approach to life. "Hello, sweetheart," I murmured, reaching down to stroke her cheek. "Ready to go home." But as James stood and began pushing the stroller toward the park exit, I realized that home wasn't a place anymore. It wasn't the Connecticut mansion I'd shared with Richard, or the apartment I'd chosen for myself, or even the future James and I might build together. Home was this feeling of being exactly where I belonged, with people who loved me for who I was rather than who they needed me to be. Home was the sound of Emma's laughter and James's voice, and my own heart beating steadily in my chest without the constant undercurrent of anxiety that had characterized the past 20 years. Home was the knowledge that I'd finally learned the difference between being safe and being free, between being cared for and being controlled, between settling for security and choosing joy. As we walked through the tree-lined paths of Central Park, pushing our daughter's stroller while other families enjoyed their Sunday morning routines around us, I thought about the girl I'd been at 22, standing at a crossroads and choosing the path that seemed safer, more certain, more practical. I wanted to tell her that she would survive the choice she was about to make, that 20 years later, she would find the courage to choose again, choose differently, choose with wisdom earned through experience and pain and growth. I wanted to tell her that it's never too late to become who you were meant to be. But mostly, I wanted to tell her what I'd learned that morning, sitting on a bench in Central Park with a ring on my finger and a baby in a stroller and a man beside me who'd waited 23 years for this moment. Sometimes the most practical thing you can do is stop being practical. Sometimes the most responsible choice is to choose happiness over security. And sometimes when you're brave enough to leave behind what's familiar for what's unknown, you discover that the life you were afraid to want was actually the life you were meant to live all along. The sound of Emma's laughter drifted back to us as James pointed out a squirrel gathering acorns. And I realized that this ordinary Sunday morning in Central Park with my daughter and the man I loved was exactly what happiness sounded like. It sounded like coming home to yourself,